Good evening. I'm Robert Polito, Director of the New School Writing Program, and it's my immense pleasure to welcome you to tonight's discussion on disruptive kinship with Judith Butler, Hélène Cixous, and Avital Ronell, moderated by Emily Apter. Co-sponsored by the New School School of Writing and Villa Gillet, this evening is another remarkable incarnation of the ongoing Walls and Bridges series in New York City. And as we move through season 3, I think we are witnessing and participating in an extraordinary cultural transformation. What our inspired comrades at Villa Gillet, Guy, Cedric, Matilda, Julie, Emmanuel, and Marianne, are creating here is resourceful, adventurous, and unprecedented. Their vision and persistence, as well as their passionate elegance and generosity of spirit, render them paradigmatic creative partners, and I wonder if we might all applaud them now. Our distinguished moderator, Emily Apter, is the author most recently of The Translation Zone, a new comparative literature from Princeton University Press, and she teaches comparative literature at NYU. As over the weekend I was thinking about the phrase disruptive kinship, I was led somehow inevitably to Arthur Rimbaud, particularly now in poet John Ashbery's brilliant recent translation of the Illuminations. In describing the process of translating Rimbaud, Ashbery focused the phrase fertile destabilization. And as another way into tonight's discussion, here is one of his short Rimbaud translations, titled Drifters, often believed to be about Rimbaud's relationship with the poet Paul Verlaine, itself a disruptive kinship, if there ever was one. Drifters. Pathetic brother, how many horrible evenings I owed him. I wasn't sufficiently involved in this enterprise. I made light of his infirmity. Because of me, we would return to exile, to slavery. He attributed to me both bad luck and innocence, each highly bizarre, and he produced disturbing reasons for this. I responded by sneering at this satanic doctor and finally went over to the window. I was creating, beyond the countryside crossed by bands playing rare music, phantoms of future nocturnal luxury. After this vaguely hygienic amusement, I lay down on a straw mattress. And almost every night, no sooner was I asleep than the poor brother rose up, his mouth rotten, his eyes gouged out. This was how he dreamed of himself, and dragged me into the room, howling his dream of stupid sorrow. I had, in fact, and in all spiritual sincerity, taken on the mission of returning him to his original state of child of the sun. And we wandered, nourished with the wine of the caverns and the hardtack of the highway, with me determined to find the location and the recipe. So please join me now in welcoming first Jay Gottlieb, who's going to give us a slight taste of what's going to happen at the conclusion of the panel discussion this evening. And then please now join me in welcoming all of the panelists and Emily Apter, who will, after Jay performs, introduce and moderate the rest of the evening. Thank you.
Give a kind of appetizer of what will be happening later. And as you can see, this is totally spontaneous because the protocol is not being observed at all. I'm here with my newfound friends, and I decided and agreed that it would be fun if I played a 3-minute work, 1 minute per panelist. And the work will be by Luciano Berio, whose birthday is today. He would have been 86. And Luciano Berio, one of the great Italian composers, one of the great composers, period, of all time, died in 2003. And wrote a series of works based on earth, wind, fire, air, and has one of the 4 then, which I would like to display, this 3-minute Luftklavier. He gave the titles in German because his publisher is in Vienna. Air keyboard. And what I love about this is that it's a total mix, speaking of kinships or disruptive kinships or affinities, shaking in their leaves, because it absolutely juxtaposes free time with measured time, which sounds like quite a miracle. But what I love in this piece is that he has an element that is totally non-measured, lives its own life, and at the same time measured. And then also what happens within the framework I just described. You have extremely abstract language mixed with another form of language that sounds abstract but is very lyric. He is not Italian for nothing.
Welcome. Thank you, Jay. And thanks for coming to this Walls and Bridges event sponsored by the Villa Gillet. Tonight's discussion will be loosely organized, as you know, around the topic of disruptive kinship. And it's part of a series of interlinked events curated by François Nudelman and Avital Ronell. They've been working together for quite a while now on questions of affinity, disaffinity, filiation, genealogy, community, and disbelonging, among other things. And tomorrow night, the events continue with chords and discords, patterns of affinities, with Pierre Bayard, Wendy Lesser, and François Nudelman at the Cultural Services of the French Embassy. If there's confusion about where it is, I think you can pick up the brochures. Now, I'm just going to give you, because we want to get to our speakers, a brief stream of associations to set the stage for this topic, a kind of score, based somewhat on the scrapings of Avital's notebook. And here are just some ideas. Disaffiliation, kinship outside of blood or race, new socialities, affinities minus families, affiliation by adoption, subcultures, communities of users, communities based on affinities, âmes sœurs, communities of kindred spirits, girlfriends, sister acts, Albertine and her little gang from Proust. A difference or disruption experienced as an incomprehensible affinity for something. The unconscious, a surge from elsewhere. Thwarted orders of nature, disordered orders of belonging, the racism of kind or species or race. The problem of genre or Geschlecht, meaning race, kinship, lineage, community, generation, sex, Menschheit, autrui, Dasein, humanity. And then from there, translation and transference, telepathy, transfinitude, and political affinities, bodies in parks. I'm not sure what our speakers will talk about tonight, but let me introduce them briefly. First, we're honored to have Hélène Cixous here from Paris. She's a writer, a playwright, a theorist and feminist thinker, co-author of the game-changing essay, The Laugh of the Medusa, a playwright with Ariane Mouchkine, Les Naufragés des Folles Espoirs, which we were trying to translate beforehand. We just decided on The Shipwreck of Mad Hope. And the one who coined the phrase and practice of écriture féminine, writing as woman, or to write woman, write in woman, as one would a language. She was a founder of the PhD in feminist studies in Paris, and that's now been sort of rebaptized genre and sexual difference studies. And she also has been working at the Collège de Philosophie in Paris, and she's the author of a book of fiction on theater called Revirement, and two beautiful books that just came out in English, which I really recommend for tonight's, if you take away so many of the problems we'll be evoking today. Hemlock and Philippine, both out this year from Polity. Judith Butler comes to us fresh off the ground of Occupy Wall Street, where she spoke of a politics of the public body and a recall of popular will. She teaches at the University of California, Berkeley, and her many books have centered our discussions: Gender Trouble, Bodies That Matter, The Psychic Life of Power, Theories of Subjection, Excitable Speech, and one bearing particularly on tonight's topic, Antigone's Claim, Kinship Between Life and Death. In asking what forms of kinship would have allowed Antigone to live, she questions how and why kinship, specifically blood ties, have come to limit the ethical order, the system of symbolic norms that regulate communities. Butler writes, Antigone says brother, but does she mean father? She perverts the law, redraws the modes of kin association, and disrupts the place of kinship as the precondition of the human. Avital Ronell, hard to describe. Let's call her a media philosopher, a critical theorist, a performance artist, a teacher at NYU, who transforms the protocols of pedagogy in seminars taught over the years with Derrida and Zizek. Recently at the Centre Pompidou, she gave 9 lecture performances, starting with a work with Werner Herzog and ending with a philosophical dance performance with Judith Butler. And maybe we'll have a reprise, I'm not sure. In Berlin, she did a critical theater piece called What Was I Thinking? A spectral colloquy. And speaking as her colleague, I would say that she is a disruptive affinity, drawing people out of their corners and into unsettled arrangements of bodies and thoughts. Her writings always disrupt. The Telephone Book, Technology, Schizophrenia, Electric Speech, Crack Wars, Stupidity, The Test Drive, Fighting Theory, and the soon-to-be-released Loser's Sons, Politics and Authority. So I'm going to turn it over first to Hélène Cixous.
If anyone wants to occupy this street right here, and instead of standing up, please feel welcome to do so.
There's also room on this side.
And under the piano. Yeah, so nobody knows what the other is going to say. But we all, I suppose, expect that we are still going to listen as we did to Jay in an affinity way, in an open way, with hospitality, maybe in a Wall Street way. I think that just before we met all together here, I told my friends here that I had the feeling when I read them that they have pre-translated me or post-translated me, that I have pre-translated them, that we are all in a kind of in-translation that permeates body and soul. And it's all a matter of translation, of accepting to translate and to be translated, or not accepting, rejecting any possibility of translation, or let me use other synonyms, dancing together, playing the multi-piano, and establishing, now I'm going to borrow a concept from physics, interaction. Interaction is a physical concept, and it basically, we need interaction. I mean, matter doesn't exist without interaction. Between atoms that do not connect, apparently, there are phenomena called interaction that make them communicate, get together, form new effects. And so this is, of course, something that one would wish would happen between human beings, but not only between human beings, between living beings, whatever. Since we are so different, we're of the same kin with differences, I thought I would refer principally today to the field where I live mostly, or most often, that is the field of literature, as, of course, relating or interacting with others. Since, in a way, for instance, literature is, I think, the utmost expression of all kinds of queernesses. I mean, it's queer. It is, in essence, it's queer. I mean, literature, if when it's worthy of the name of literature, it is queer, always. I've noted, I've picked up the overtitle of the title and the subtitles of this huge marathon titled ceremony of today. So I think at the top, or maybe it's at the bottom, there was there were the words walls and bridges. I kept wondering, why they had been chosen, but never mind, since they're there, roaming.
Bridge and tunnel.
So let me say just two words, literally speaking, about walls and bridges. Maybe you know about the small fable of Kafka, which is called The Bridge. That is, it is not called The Bridge. That's an English expression. It's called Die Brücke. Die Brücke, that is, the bridge in German, is feminine. And Kafka tells us about being himself, die Brücke. Ich war eine Brücke. The subject, Kafka, happened to be eine Brücke, a feminine bridge. I mean, it's silly to say a feminine bridge. A bridge in German is feminine. And all kinds of mishaps, of course, happen to Die Brücke, being perforated by the umbrella of somebody who's trying to cross the bridge. And it ends, as you may imagine, tragically, as it's bound to happen when a bridge is a female or a feminine type of being. So immediately, of course, you realize that in literature, what we have to do is always metamorphosis. Now, if we are beings who are subject to metamorphosis, that means that we are many and in an infinite or indefinite way. As for walls, first of all, let me tell you that a wall which we imagine is plain and solid is actually originally, on the contrary, made of a series of bars which, of course, allow for intervals. That's for your music. It's a sequence of pieces of wood or of iron and emptiness, void, interval that relate and, after all, resemble somehow the piano in a vertical way. But you may remember that wall is a very important character in Shakespeare, in Midsummer Night's Dream. And since the actors in Midsummer Night's Dream have to play an ancient play with which stages two characters who are lovers, and those lovers are, as all lovers are, disruptively affined, and they're called Pyramid and Thisbe. They want to join, and they cannot join except through a wall. But our actors have a difficulty they're not supposed to bring a wall on the stage. So they bring a wall on the stage instead of bringing a wall on the stage. And wall is snout. Snout is wall. Snout is an actor who is told that you're going to be wall. You're going to be wall. You certainly remember that. Let me just quote, because it's too beautiful. If I find wall, I think wall has disappeared. Oh no, there he is. This man with lime and rough cast doth present wall, that vile wall which did these lovers sunder, and through walls chink, poor souls, they are content to whisper. So you see, that's the real wall. That's the Berlin Wall. You had to whisper through the wall. Remembering that a wall is something through which you love and whisper. Bottom speaking to the wall. And thou, O wall, O sweet, O lovely wall, that standest between her father's ground and mine, thou wall, O sweet and lovely wall, show me that chink to blink through with mine eye. Of course, you might also spot all kinds of innuendos, sexual innuendos. The wall is also male and female. To come back to translation, when you're many, and what we're many, then you have to translate not only yourself into others or the other into your body and soul, but yourself to yourselves, or yourselves to yourself. Let me just quote a moment of difficulty of a famous hero whom I'll not name immediately. If there are 76 different times all ticking in the mind at once, how many different people are there not? Heaven help us. All having lodgment at one time or another in the human spirit. Some say 2052, so that it's the most usual thing in the world for a person to say directly they are alone. Orlando, if that is one's name. Meaning by that, come, come, I'm sick to death of this particular self, I want another. But it's not altogether plain sailing either, for though one may say, as Orlando said, Orlando, he's calling himself on the telephone. Still, the Orlando she needs, or he needs, you know that Orlando is a he who is she, may not come. These selves of which we are built up, one on top of another, as plates are piled on a waiter's hand, have attachments elsewhere, sympathies, little constitutions, and rights of their own. Call them what you will, so that one will only come if it's raining, another in a room with green curtains, another when Mrs. Jones is not there, another if you can promise it a glass of wine, and so on, etc., etc. In the end, Orlando has evaluated his presences inside his presence to the modest number of 6,000, which is really modest. We are so many. Of course, this is not accepted usually. We have to have a document, an ID, and with only one representing the 6,000, which is never democratic and always self-despotic. But I don't want to remain only on Marcel, you may remember, Marcel in Proust was now and then an army and a battlefield. But you may also remember that the very first page of La Recherche tells us of the subtle composition for about 3 minutes of the narrator. I myself, that's after five lines after the beginning, I myself was what the book was talking about. I was a church, a quartet, the rivalry between François Ier and Charles I and Charles V. A little later, in about 3 pages after the beginning, we have a lesson in pre-Butlerism. And it's interpreted by my dear Avital, who were being copied beforehand in an anticipatory way by Proust. And it's on the Orlando pattern. In a moment, the image of the self is reminded that it or he or them or they exist by the glimpse of oil lamps, then of wing-color shirts, gradually recomposed into the self's original features. But here is something that troubles me, and it has to do with translation. The writer whom you know is telling us about the mysteries of being awake and being asleep, which are not separate. That is, you can very well be awake while you're asleep. And while you can dream that you're asleep and that you wake in your sleep, and realizing that you have awakened within a dream, then you go to sleep again, etc., which is exactly our fate. If we could read Proust in his own music, which is essential, the original French language, then we would have pages that would be musically inscribed with the phoneme ré. Réveiller, réhabiliter. Ré, actually, of course it's one syllable in a word, it cannot be preserved or saved in translation. So the whole partition in ré disappears in translation. Ré, that is D. I had to ask Jay. So actually the whole first chapter of the whole first chapter of Proust is written in D. But that, of course, you cannot realize if you read it in English. So we lose part of the music, which, of course, works as gluons in physics work. That is, interacts so that things that are supposed not to communicate become one without disappearing. A chord and a quartet will resound together harmoniously through the interaction of a D, if it's translated. So you see that we do need translating. But it's not only between human beings, if I can say so, but between otherly human beings, or human beings that are others. For instance, so I dedicate the last words of what I'm saying to you to my mother, who is 101, 101. It's a palindrome. So, who has become, at the age of 99, translated into other species. Since she was getting tired of being merely human. And I suddenly realized that she had become a species with whom she had never had affinities. But it appeared that not having affinities before was, of course, probably a way of defending herself from the impregnation or the visits of other species. And that was cats. So at the age of 99, she became a kind of cat, a genre of cat, a sort of cat, a species of cat, a line of cat. And at first, she made friends with the cats in the house, who immediately adopted her, because cats are not racists. And who started teaching her their language, which makes for the fact that in my house now, there are 3 cat-speaking people. And now and then people tell me, oh, the cat is here. So I tell them, no, this is my mother. And she expresses herself catly all the time, which of course is as understandable and translatable as cat's language. And the other species to which she has turned to, as on her way to a number of ultimate metamorphoses, is flowers, generally speaking, but not, and special flowers particularly. So she has become a kind of geranium. She is very much attracted by very red flowers, whereas you know that Orlando was yellow. When he comes inside our lives as a young man, as a young bright man, who doesn't know he's going to be, he is, in fact, actually a woman, he is yellowed by the reflection of yellow panes. Pains, you know, pains, I mean painful, no. And of course, he's influenced by the color yellow, so all of us are influenced by colors. My dear friend here, you've put off the yellow?
I was thinking of Werther, who's yellow.
Of course, of course. So that's translation, chromatic. whether it's musical or whether, yeah, there she is, yeah.
I'll put back the yellow.
Yeah. Usually I'm saffron. Not saffron, saffron. So, but maybe, I think I've run out of time. So, no, it's the...
Now that you started talking about me.
But that's... You can take my word and meow.
That's such a beautiful place to stop that I will take the opportunity to come back to discussion among you, but let's pass it to Judy.
You know, most of us cannot see you at all.
Right. Oh, okay. So do you want to stand?
Well, speaking of kinship, my father used to say, he was a very short man, and he would say, I bet you think I'm still sitting. Nice invocation, but I will stand just so I can make a certain connection. I hope that's okay. I'm very pleased to be here this evening and to be in discussion with both Avital Ronell and Hélène Cixous. I presume we're here because there is some kinship among us, and I suppose it is the task of the evening to find out what kind of kinship that might turn out to be. There are two words that confront us, kinship and disruption. And as I begin, I'm not sure whether we're asked to think about forms of kinship that are particularly disruptive. And if that's the case, we'd need to know what they're meant to disrupt or how we might define them. If kinship is a way of ordering relationships, we can ask whether there's a particular ordering that disrupts another order, one which we consider too rigid or in need of some kinship trouble. Or perhaps the linkage between these two terms, kinship and disruption, takes another form, namely that kinship itself rests upon a certain disruption. And if that is so, how do we approach this more disruptive domain? Are we still in the orbit of a problematic that imagines order on the side of kinship and disruption on some other side? I think matters become more complicated when we realize that this kinship in English is not quite translatable into French. In the French, we have parenté, we have filiation, which means that a certain gap opens between the question of who can be a parent, for instance, or from what line does the child descend. In either case, we're restricted to the question of family structure. Oddly enough, the term kinship emerged within feminist anthropology in the US and the UK precisely to ask about forms of relationship that were binding, even constitutive, that exceed the particular form of the family. If kinship relations exceed family relations, then the family is but one historical instance of kinship. And through the term kinship, we can start to ask what kinds of relationships are the most basic of human bonds, from what kinds of relationships are the most basic of human bonds forged and formed, how are basic relations of intimacy and need organized through time and space, what are their variabilities and their possibilities. Of course, this then led through a number of important feminist works and queer work to thinking about queer kinship or modes of intimate alliance that take neither conjugality nor reproduction as their defining moments. And of course, this has led to even more complicated terrain, since not all human bonds, not all intimate bonds are kin relations. So how do we distinguish, if we do, between family, kin, community, and even broader modes of belonging that provide some kind of provisional and iterable structure to intimate and constitutive relations? Note how quickly we seem to founder here on the categories themselves. If kinship is defined neither exclusively by reproductive neither exclusively by reproductive nor marital relations, then how do we delimit the field of kinship itself? Are we of necessity launched into a non-delimitable and illimitable domain? In other words, are our kinship categories subjected to open-ended temporal iteration, to a disruption of that kind, a kind of constant or even constitutive disruption that is part of their elaboration, without which there can be no temporal and historical re-elaboration? My wager is that we can't really begin with stipulative definitions, since it may be that we only know kinship relations through the breach, or so that would be one lesson we might take from the nexus of Greek tragedy and psychoanalysis. It might be more useful to ask, at what particular moments does someone become kin? Or is someone recognized to be kin? It can be a moment in which one feels, I cannot live without this person, and I must absolutely live without this person, or that this person loves me madly, and that I will surely be killed by this person. Or I am invited to speak and told not to come with a paper, only then to be asked to come with a paper on the day before. Of course, the only reason this is maddening, if it is that one's father says you are perfect and one's mother wants you dead, or because the grandmother says, why don't you eat my food? And then after you start eating, she says, you know, you don't have to eat so much. You don't have to finish that plate. So it's a sudden swing that belongs, we might say, to the absolutes of affective life, intense adulation and the fear of death, converging at the site of ordinary life. I belong here. I will die if I stay here. This is one form the knot of kinship takes. So it's not an order that quells a disturbance or a disruption. It's rather a disruption that takes place, a breach that is prior to any question of rule or law. Indeed, order, rule, and law always arrive belatedly to make sense of the breach, but as we know, they do not stop the breach from happening again. Indeed, the repetition of the breach is precisely the sign and substance of kinship itself. So I want to suggest that kinship charts and genealogical studies and any of the formal analyses of kinship that we find in classical modes of anthropology or archival history all seek to codify a set of relations that are from the start subject to misrecognition and murderous confusion. So if we think about Oedipus, the truth of the matter is that he could not properly recognize his mother or his father, or at least he could not recognize them consciously, which opens up the question of how unconscious forms of intimating kinship take place. But we could also ask whether the father becomes the father at the moment of the murder, and if the mother in some sense ascends to her maternal place at the moment of sexual relations, or if kinship really gets conferred later, retrospectively, when the acknowledgement comes with infinite guilt and self-punishment. What? That was my father I slew? What? That was my mother with whom I slept? More often than not, so I'm sorry, you have to make them Jewish to translate into New York. I'm trying to make this into a New York event. Plus, one has to sort of draw on one's own unconscious if one's going to make sense of kinship, right? More often than not, characters in Greek tragedy have to be persuaded that someone was actually their kin only after a certain set of actions have taken place. And that persuasion usually happens through authoritative narratives that someone, usually blind like Tiresias, is willing to offer. Or think of Antigone when she invokes her singular love for her brother. Well, according to the genealogy, she could mean Polynices, Eteocles, or Oedipus himself. Right, so she contradicts herself at the moment. She makes an impossible utterance at the moment of proclaiming her singular love. Which one is the brother, can we say? In the Bacchae, There's a frenzied hunt and dismemberment of Pentheus, perhaps you remember, and it's accomplished most dramatically by his mother, Agawe, and it's undergone in a kind of blind frenzy. At the same time, the destruction is collectively performed by the Bacchic women in response to a command to hunt and kill Pentheus, one delivered by Dionysus. Pentheus has lost control of the women, and the women have entered into libidinal frenzy. They occupy themselves first with wine and then sexual relations. And when Dionysus arrives in those woods and commands them to hunt and destroy Pentheus, they follow, like Manson followers. Though women are not precisely liberated, they just submit deliriously to another command. And for the record, Cadmus, who's the father of Agwe and Semele, he emerges as an authority at the end. Semele, you might remember, gives birth to Dionysus, or so it seems, and then dies. Agawe gives birth to Pentheus, so the agon of the play is between two cousins, Pentheus and Dionysus. Throughout the play, kinship takes form either through an accusation, a fantasy, or a guilt-ridden recognition. The play opens with Dionysus, who has assumed the form of man, he's a god, who explains why he has chosen Thebes as the place to raise his Bacchic shout. He starts recruiting women to leave their homes for the woods. Semele, his mother, after being urged by her father, claimed in public that Zeus was, in fact, the father of her, Semele's child. Okay, so the position of the father is defined here as one who compels the daughter to lie precisely about who is the father of her child. The kinship position is articulated through a kind of double lie. The sisters of Semele had previously said that she bore the child by some mortal, and when she then died, this same group of truth-driven sisters claimed that Zeus took Semele's life because of the false accusation made against him. So sisters seem to be those who defend each other against false accusations, but themselves have the hubris to accuse the gods and get destroyed. Dionysus punishes them all with a form of delirium that forces them, interestingly, to leave the home, the site of kinship itself, or at least its site of provisional containment. He says, "Therefore I have driven those same sisters mad, turned them all frantic out of doors. Their home now is the mountain. Their wits are gone. I've made them bear the emblem of my mysteries. The whole female population of Thebes to the last woman I have sent raving from their homes." Okay. Now you'll remember, enraged by the false accusation against him, Zeus, we are told, throws a firebolt or a lightning flash that somehow extracts the child from the mother, Semele, that it kills. So Semele dies. Zeus then takes the child. The child is beamed up in some way, eager to hide the gestating pre-infant from Hera, always jealous. He sews the infant into his own thigh with golden pins, where gestation presumably continues until Zeus himself gives birth in his own way, via the thigh, to Dionysus. And it would seem that Dionysus assumes divine qualities when he's separated from his human mother, beamed up to Zeus, and when he's sprung into the world through the unpinning of the thigh. So though Zeus is not the father and was enraged by the false accusation, he does take over the gestational process of the mother after dispensing with the first mother. Why does the man become a mother when he is falsely accused of being the father? This suggests something of the gender trouble at the heart of kinship trouble, but more on that later. This is only one of many interesting transformations, we could say metamorphoses, in this play. And in some ways, the motif is repeated when Dionysus persuades Pentheus to dress up as a woman, to hold the thyrsus, and to move and dance with the Bacchic women as one of them. It's a great drag scene, another moment of gender slippage, which proves crucial to the exercise of kinship here. Pentheus falls prey to the charms of Dionysus, not only doubled up as a woman, but starting to see double himself, which is the Thebes he knows. The chorus becomes delirious, claiming now to be in submission to Dionysus, and when Pentheus's mother leads the pack to dismember her son, she does not recognize him. Is that because he is, for a moment, dressed up as a girl? I think not, for she's convinced that he is a young mountain lion, which would have to be true if she were to be a huntress. So we can see, again, a moment of cross-species metamorphosis, right? The cat is my mother. The mountain lion is my son. And so when she holds the head of her son and asks, upon recognizing that this is her son, who has done this monstrous deed, she does not recognize that she's the one who did the deed until the story is authoritatively narrated to her ex post facto. There's an effort to restore order. Cadmus reasserts paternal authority, insisting that she recognize that she has killed her own son. Her initial refusal is followed by reluctant and appalled acceptance, and with that recognition comes irreversible and limitless grief. Another defining sign of kinship, to be sure. But so too is the blindness. Every kin position is subject to misrecognition. That is not my son. It is a mountain lion. That cannot be my mother. How did he come to be my father? Or, you are not my mother precisely because you are my mother, and I am your child precisely because I am absolutely not your child. These are not exactly narrative structures, but constitutive binds. In fact, nowhere are the positions and rules taken for granted here. They neither effectively order passions, nor do their punishments always hold firm. In this way, kinship relations are articulated in the breach and in the guilt and sorrow that follows, sites of murderous pleasure and infinite remorse. So though we might say that none of these stories would have the force that they have if there were not kinship relations already there, structuring the story from the start, I want to suggest that those relations are enacted precisely through the disruptions that come to define them. Perhaps kinship cannot really be mapped, but only exercised through displacement, inversion, and modes of passionate unknowingness. In other words, kinship is the mode of living out a set of passions that constantly disrupt one another. I love you, I murder you, I grieve you, I cannot live without you, I must live without you. Eat, don't eat, stay, leave, or rather stay, or rather leave, or stay, or leave, stay.
How's everybody? Feeling some kinship or breaches? So, if these spirits have offended, think but this, and all is mended, that you have but slumbered here while these thinkers did appear. That came up to me from Hélène Cixous' calling us to Shakespeare. And of course, when Shakespeare is called up, the dossier opens with Hamlet also, who says, as you recall, more than kin and less than kind. Now, we could jam on that, and thank you for opening with Rimbaud and with poeticity that links us in so many ways. More than kin and less than kind, with all of the registers of we're not the same kind, we're not the same species, and you're an asshole. You're less than kind. You're not so kind to me. So, I mean, that's what I think it may suggest. We have tried to expose our distances in order to assert, however precariously, some indisputable proximities among us. We are tightroping over the abyss of human relations, calling to each other from afar, according to unreadable algorithms of encounter. This may be what the event of the encounter is all about. Unprogrammable, disruptive from the get-go, ever disturbed and like a runaway concept, rogue, yet calling out to you. The thought of affinities, the thought of kinship can be brought close, if you'll allow this, to what Derrida calls the cut that binds. Right? I'd like to think, and this is, I'm just following in the breaches that were set up as terrible medieval torture instruments. The breaches, the traumatic way in which we bind to one another or to each other. So despite all the differences and probabilities that govern the space of possible identity, pulling together, getting it on, and so on, we show up in what severs and cuts, inscribing us. In some measure, and despite it all, we are cut to each other's size, at least for now, finite and attuned, finely cut with diamantine precision and existential scarring, historical contour. Ach, hi Wolfgang. Ach, I feel the tick-tock of our timer, the crush of timing. I follow the trail into what cannot happen between us, what fails among us. So I'm thinking and I'm convoking our teachers and friends. I'm thinking in terms of kinship network this evening, thinking of Friedrich Kittler, who left his body last week. And I always think, of course, when an assignment is given or I'm asked to join the signifying chain gang and do my work, right, and slide into paleonymic disaster zones. Do you all know what paleonymic is? Do you want to know? So it's another Derrida startup machine that we're stuck with old names and old ways of naming. So, you know, you may want to full speed ahead or do some way of advancing in this life, but language lassos us back and yanks us back and smacks the shit out of us and limits us. But I don't want to talk about my problems up here. I'm pulled toward, I'm inevitably and ineluctably bound by the dark side, the dubious aggregation, the demonic pull, the death-driven edges of Mitsein. So kinship is also perhaps a way of thinking the fissures and holes punched in being with Mitsein, what it is to be with each other. Being is what we share. We are with each other in a certain way. Derrida pointed out, have I said Derrida's name yet? Derrida pointed out that in English, maybe unlike some of our other language that bind and cut us apart, keep us apart, that the beautiful without in the beautiful English language is connected unstoppably to a with. So if we had time to jam on this and to go to the out of the without, which is to say that even if there's a kind of letting go and severance policy here in this term, we're still without. So there's a tensional structure that holds us in a certain way. Now, being with Mitsein, put this alongside Hélène Cixous, Proust's Toute Seule, which she offered in a seminar that I attended, which is, and the question around this, or one of the dizzying and brilliant and endless, inexhaustible questions was, why do we say all alone? Isn't it enough? Isn't it shitty enough to be alone? To be stuck without your catastrophic aloneness? So why do we say in all our languages, actually, ganz allein, all alone? Kafka facing his father, ich war eine Brücke. No, wrong thing. Kafka facing his father says often in the famous Brief an Vater, the letter to my father, well, to his father, to my father. Your father, Judith. It's your father. The obscene father. Okay, I'm not going to go and mess with your father. But so Kafka, facing his father, says often and repeats that he's ganz allein. And that's where I hooked up with Hélène's work on Proust's being tout seul. So why isn't it sufficient to be alone? In Kafka's disruptive kinship network, it's a matter of standing and jumping with the dead within the haunted vaults and precincts under which we walk. Phantom kinships, alliances with non-present, things that fall off the scale of what you can say is with you or without you. So there's even an interval between what seems to present itself and what has left its space of material recognizability or locatability, etc. So I was worried. I tell you, I was worried. I was worried that François, with his affinities, was in a covert way bypassing the rich store of psychoanalytic insight and unconscious pulley levers and lovers that bind us in inexplicable ways and push us beyond the pleasure principle. I was worried. I am worried that psychoanalysis somehow gets possibly displaced in a way that may return or may not, I don't know. I'm thinking of the couple Goethe and Freud in terms of private kinship, and if we had time, and maybe we will later on, to try to unfold textual kinships or kinships between networks between poems or among poetic utterances where one tries to outdo the other, to erase the predecessor, to have a relationship. In some cases, like in a lot of texts, such as that of those of De Quincey or Wordsworth, they're smoking each other. They're on tropium in a certain way. They, whenever De Quincey or Walter Benjamin, for that matter, want to explain what an experience of ownmost connectedness is, they open up an abyss and quote the other. So they're smoking each other. They're on each other. This is something to consider. But Freud and Goethe as a couple is something that I try to listen in on when considering the traumatic beginnings of psychoanalysis. Okay, so the start-off plan here, the signifier that started up this machine was affinities, elective affinities. So I want to tell you just a little bit, and then we open into discussant mode, if you wish. Do you want to hear about it? How's your energy? You okay? You can handle it? Because, I don't have a particular jouissance or avidity in boring the shit out of you. I don't need to stand up here and make a fool of myself. No, okay, then I will continue. So, Wahlverwandtschaften in German and elective affinities is Goethe's famous text in which affinities becomes a question of, it's a distressed question of how people might relate to each other in ways that can't be substantialized or really subjected to law or laws of psychology or other kinds of laws. Goethe was pushing 60. He was distressed and disturbed, thinking through the transferential circuitry that call us to one another, all the transfers and translations that are required when you sign up with the other. Who the hell are you with? What have you done? And it requires a kind of infinite translating machine. So marriage, Goethe knew, was a bust, but other types of association, filiations, adoptions, and enrollments were simply boring. but also offered a dismal set of non-starters. So he started setting everything according to the death drive. So the characters who kind of affinities and kinship are certain ways of getting together and pulling apart based on chemistry, as we say in all our languages. When you have chemistry with someone else, what the hell does that mean? In Schlegel and Goethe, it meant a provisional kind of lockdown with the other, but it's going to dissolve and it's going to go the way of finitude. So the main characters in this novel are called Ottilie, in French, I guess, Otto, and related to Tod always. So they are about dissolution and breakup, as Benjamin emphasizes in his reading of the elective Affinities. So I just wanted to open a dossier and not exhaust it or exhaust you by mentioning the couple that Freud and Goethe are, how transference might work, because Freud said that psychoanalysis began when he heard a text by Goethe that freaked him out. So it began, and the attachment to Goethe began by an aversion, a very phobic reactivity. It's not have a nice text, I'm so happily influenced by you. It's a shock effect. It proceeds by destruction, like a technological proving ground where one tests to failure. So I wanted to consider with you one day, maybe not here, how poems read and punch each other out, reciprocal smackdowns of texts, and I would just want to take momentarily the off-ramp right now and here and say that all of this is also meant to mark an implicit testimonial covenant. So what's going on here? We all gave a certain little suggestion of what's going on, that there are so many registers and stopovers in our relationships. There's so many histories of evasion, of bereftness in terms of language and thanking the other. Hélène Cixous is my teacher, my friend. I say the same of Judith Butler, but in an entirely different way, and of Emily Apter. And so there's something that we could also want to discuss, which is what happens when we're in a purportedly pedagogical scene, if that's what we're in, and what the transferential systems are that link or cut us apart. Something I might call edipedagogy, listening to Judith and what she was unfolding for us. So what happens, what kind of attachments or attachment disorders are also inscribed in the very possibility of, and this, remember, Freud reminds us, is traumatic, of keeping your ears open to one another. Thank you.
I'm going to encourage the three of you to maybe have some reactions and discussions on the basis of so many interesting things you've said. You'll discover what you want to talk about, but I was thinking that there were some interesting overlaps. There's a moment in the text of Philippine by Cixous where she talks about the structure Freuderida as one word, one name. And this question of, and some of the discussion in that book is about Freud and his disciples and the circle, the Vienna Circle, but then it sort of moves between these little historic moments and flashbacks into something very personal, which is, in a sense, the channeling of Derrida throughout her work that continues after he's gone, and also made me think of an experience that happened to me recently with Prudence Whittlesby, who is painting over there, and who did a portrait, and lo and behold, I saw not myself in the picture, but my father, and she'd never seen my father, so she had simply transmuted an aura and a memory into, and I began to believe in channeling and telepathy and auratic transfer in a way that was unlike anything I'd experienced. So this is something, part of what is kind of sitting with me, not only listening to Avital talk about attachments and frenemies, and which is another form of disruptive kinship in a way, but also this question of something that is transfinite and telepathic, and yet also pre-translational. So that would be one set of issues and questions to Hélène, but also to everyone else. And then, very briefly, also her incredible evocation of the field of relationality that extends to objects and to animals and to other species, and means that you have a relationship and you can speak catly. And so that whole question of not just object orientation, but actual animation and living with objects as they were, as beings, and taking away, in a sense, the kind of weight of what being or Dasein is in its historic, philosophical, autonomous sense, and creating something very relational. And then listening to Judith, and I'd love her to say more maybe about this untranslatability of parenté, filiation, kinship, what gets left out. And even thinking about this legislation where you now want to occupy the egg and make a relationship. There's this legislation in Mississippi that's spreading around the country about when does a person start. So it's not just when does kinship start, but it's very linked to the politics of where the egg is and when it becomes personhood, and this whole kind of fetishism of person that is at the heart of the kinship discussion. And I've lost my notes with Avital. So I'm going to just stop there. And
I'm not going to let this slide, by the way. We'll discuss that's what happens when you evoke psychoanalysis. It bites you in the ass. She then acts out psychoanalytically on cue. But I'm not going to say anything. Oh, am I talking out loud?
You're the champion of rhetorician.
That's really weird. That's perfect.
Okay. Well, there are so many questions that I'll answer beside the question. I just wanted to echo what Judith said when she revived so many myths that are, of course, not past. They're with us all the time. We are Zeus and Pentheus, etc. Because actually, maybe what comes to be so ferociously obvious when Judith reminds us, maybe we don't want to think ever or really believe that murder and family are almost synonym. Murder is in the family, murder is the family is murder. Of course, we don't very much like to think that. We prefer to think that family is love, etc., which it is, but love is also murder. So the Greeks knew it, and they dealt with it because they preceded Christianity, and they ignored Judaism. But it's there, and why? So I hope psychoanalysis is not to bite me. In a way, let's be very simple. It's terrible to be of the same blood, because it's inside yourself. Even if we don't think in those terms, it's with us. So, of course, it's forbidden to kill my kin. Also because it's forbidden to kill myself. I mean, I don't want to kill myself. When I kill my kin, I shed my own blood. And as Aeschylus says, the blood doesn't climb back into the veins. And another reproach that we throw at the idea of the family and the weight of the family, it's that we've not chosen. We're chosen. We have not chosen. We're inside before we know. And in order to simply breathe, and I think that Judith has underlined that very well, we need disruption. We need distance. We need to have our country preserved. We need frontiers. And now to pick up what you said, Avital, we need to be aligned, not guns aligned, that's too much, but aligned. We need aloneness, we need solitude, which is totally forbidden in the family. And the family is a kind of monster that gulps us, eats us up, and of course we reject that. We want to kill, and it's forbidden, which is why the family is the unit of all tragedy, and it's the structure that is at the beginning of all structures, all human structures. The nation is a family, communities are the family, etc., etc. We repeat the family all the time, and we hate it, and we love it. But as I said, love, of course, is torn by what is unbearable in the appetite of love. It's very difficult to resist the fact that love loves love and wants to eat love. Not me, but okay. It's narcissistic. So this is why I think, first of all, I've always cherished the notion of adoption. Because you believe when you have a child, in Waldverwandtschaft, you may remember that when the kid is born, the parents don't have the child. But Goethe writes that a child had come, he arrives, as if nobody was, and it's true, nobody were his parents. We need indeed to, when we have children, it's only the first step, and then of course we would go back to the fetus, etc. This is another question. But we start relating to a child when we adopt the child. That's the moment when we adopt the child. Then you asked, when is the moment when kinship appears? That's a huge question, of course. Because the moment of adoption is when you do adopt, really, I mean, concretely, legally, etc., a child, you think that you adopt the child on the day that you adopt the child. But then, of course, it's not true. You will have adopted at one point, but it's not going to be on that day precisely. Although there may be exceptions. Maybe there are stories where you can really decide that this day, at that time, there has been a kind of epiphany where indeed the adoption has taken place as a kind of first making love. But anyway, we have to adopt. As regards literature, which I do cherish, Oh, no, to come back to the affinities, because it's huge. You were quoting Ottilie, and of course Tort, and Edward. And I remember that I thought that in this incredible novel of Goethe, there was something that was introduced that reminded me of Romeo and Juliet, because we keep forgetting that, you remember probably, or you have forgotten, that Romeo doesn't love Juliet first. He has a first love. We always forget that, you know. The first act of Romeo and Juliet is the mad love of Romeo for, I've forgotten her name.
So is he. Yeah.
Okay.
That's what happens.
Yeah.
That's how Werther starts too.
But because it's exactly because Goethe he knows about Shakespeare and psychoanalysis. That is, the first love is never the first love. You've killed the first love in order to have the first love. So, and in the elective affinities, actually the first couple is that of Charlotte and Edward, and they are made for each other. They adore each other. They've been waiting for each other for 20 years. And the moment they're together, they quit. And because you have different instances of affinities or of kinship, Edward falls in love with the other Charlotte, who is actually the niece of Charlotte. That is Charlotte the other, the second one. He has to kill Charlotte in order to love the other Charlotte, Ottilie, a little piece of anagram of Charlotte. Charlottilie. And there's a scene in the novel which is extraordinary. It's the moment when Edward, who is much older than the little Ottilie, discovers that she loves him. And it is the moment when he looks at, she has been acting as a kind of secretary. She copies everything that, all the papers of Edward. So this is the introduction of Poison, you know, writing. She is copying pages and pages and pages, and he's very happy because she's putting all his disorder into an order. And suddenly, as he looks at the pages by and by, suddenly he realizes that the last pages are in his own handwriting. A thing that you cannot say in French, because she has grafted his hand. You know, his hand is grafted on her arm. She writes with his hand. So he sees that, it's his handwriting. And he says, "You love me." That is, she's become a piece of him, or he has become a piece of her, which, of course, is mortal. But this, you have to read the novel in order to see how it develops, because it's so deep. This is why I prefer kinship in literature. Why? Because, first of all, when you kin with other writers, other works, which a real writer does, because he relates to predecessors and to those who will follow, you know that there is something that is called intertextuality, or you graft other works inside your works. You know that this is largely done in French literature, for instance, where when you read Proust, you read the whole of French literature. And when you read Joyce, you read the whole of English literature. Complete. Everything is there. And so it's been adopted, it's been swallowed, it's been thrown up, reinscribed, and in a way which preserves the predecessor at the same time that it buries it. But the monument is there. And so you can love, you can adore the other without killing. So you'll tell me, but if you swallow and the other, it's a way of killing, but you can't kill somebody who is dead, which is why I prefer to deal with fictitious people, with dead people. For instance, I had never any problem with playing literature with my father or with other writers who are dead. We wouldn't do that with a living writer. It would be very problematic to love, hate a living writer. But, of course, when we are together here, and since I think that there are, what comes to our help also is the fact that there is a kind of playfulness which I'm sure you enjoy. We know that each of us, we're completely different. We have...
What?
Yes, completely.
No.
Not guns.
Okay.
There is enough distance between us for us to be close without biting one another, which is why I enjoy.
Are you sure? Is this a wish? Which way does it go?
To bite? No, I don't want to bite you. I like to pat you, to cat you,
To pet me.
to cat you.
I'll bite
No.
you, honey. Thank you. Finally.
No, but she plays the part of bite.
That's true.
I don't know whether I play the part of wall or the part of bottom. I don't know. Never mind. So,
It's lonely as a top. No? Okay.
your turn.
No, I'll shut
Your
up.
turn.
Go ahead. I'm
Your turn.
Papageno now. You were saying.
What you want to say? Not too much. Much, very much, infinitely much, but not too infinitely much.
No, you said playfulness, and then I broke into song, and so I felt provoked. But that doesn't mean I want to bite you now.
No,
So go ahead.
no, I've done for the
Okay.
moment.
Well, since Emily forgot me, I think it's anyway Judith's turn.
Well, you go ahead. I was just going to come to, I found my notes about you. I was going to ask you more about Mitsein
Oh,
and neighboring.
okay, Judith. Go ahead. No,
But you don't have, you can talk about something else, obviously.
no, that opens a big field of possibilities, certainly. And all I'll say to initiate a program that we can or don't need to pursue at this time is what Lacan told us long ago, namely, and he said that Freud had this insight, certainly, what a disaster it was when we were encouraged to or even obligated to love our neighbors as we love ourselves. Because self-love does not have a great track record. And we're so fucked up that if that's how you love your neighbors, no wonder there's right now about 35 wars on this planet. So there's a question also of which languages can say something like the next, the near of kin, what is near, what is, there's certain words that fail surprisingly. In English, I think, that we have to take recourse to the neighbor or neighborhood, which brings us to the neighborhood of Heidegger and Mitsein, perhaps, nonetheless is highly problematic. How do you name someone who is in proximity or near to you? And also what I wanted to introduce to the discussion is you've written on evasion so beautifully, and I felt myself inscribed in some ways, how I've evaded, how you also avert your gaze at the very moment. This is nothing new, it's quite classic. At the very moment of when you would want to acknowledge and adopt and mark a profound proximity, and I don't know if that's a displacement from kinship and the other breaches that we jump into far too readily sometimes. Isn't there also something like the propulsion of a phobic flight. So one question that I would open up is, when does it get too close, too far? And these are Heideggerian questions of which also switch off on each other. When you think you're really close, you might have abysses to clear, as Nietzsche would say. Or when you think you're very far apart and there's terrible distances and the distance of freinage or braking distance, you might be very close at that moment. So there's something unknowable in all this, which is why we were convoked here. And the other point that I might mention in terms of neighborhood and disruption of neighborhood is that you may think we're in New York, but we were invited by Guy Walter and his team from Lyon. So we were invited almost like sometimes, you know, those transplants of grapes to California before they become French wine. There was something that happened here in the circuitry of grafting and drafting and displacement. There's something that happened here that destabilized our neighborhood of proximity, because we were brought together by La France, which is conçue par Dieu, as someone said. So there's the question of kinship, love, hatred, wanna-be Frenchies, want to eat those Frenchies for breakfast, for lunch and dinner, and the relation, the cannibalistic libido that is involved whenever those who consider themselves New Yorkers or Americans. New York was recently invaded 10 years ago by the United States of America, but that's another story. There's the cannibalistic, the oral cannibalistic libido is, by the way, a good thing. It can scare little children who then have to have heavy therapy sessions when you say, "You're so cute, I want to eat you up." You know, but that's so if we want to eat the French on whatever level, like eat them for breakfast, I don't know if do you know what that means? Shall I translate that? To eat you for breakfast is a very aggressive thing, you know, that we could really, okay. But so see, there's an agonistic relationship. There's the hospitality that was called upon. There's the musical fabulousness that Jay Gottlieb brought to us, which also opened our ears, maybe traumatically, maybe with difficulty, to the possibility of speaking to each other. Right now, Hölderlin is coming in and saying, "Seid ein Gespräch, wir sind," meaning Gespräch in German, which is a conversation which cuts itself off and has something to do with Mitsein, Gemeinschaft, and also Gemeinheit sometimes. But in any case, the moment that we're speaking, says Hölderlin, is, or the act or fact or cat of speaking. By the way, in speech act theory, there's always cats slithering through Austin's text. They're always the example.
It's cat. It's act.
It's a speech cat.
It's a speech cat.
You're absolutely right. You made me realize that. A speech cat theory. Purr. So, and so there's a lot going on. There's many levels of who invited whom, who is holding whom hostage here, what languages are we speaking. There are novels of Kafka where he suddenly says, by the way, we're all speaking French. And this is, you know, when you're teaching in English and reading German, and then Kafka in the castle says, this is all in French. Then what do? Then you have to imagine what he's imagining writing to Hélène Cixous. So I love that there's that murder equals family. Now I feel a little bit let off the hook of what I've done, but I can't confess because it has legal consequences.
It's 7:35, okay.
No, we have more time.
We do, okay. We'll just take a little more time.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, this is very rich. It seems to me that I'd like to go back to a moment when Hélène remarked that we are beings who are subject to a metamorphosis, and we're living beings who are subject to a metamorphosis, and she suggested the term interaction from the sciences to explain something about the process of that metamorphosis that produces effects which are not, I think, always anticipated. And I was aware that in speaking myself, I was a little less optimistic about interaction. But Avital, I think, returned us to an interesting balance by suggesting to us that transferential systems link us and pull us apart both. So underscoring both linkage and tornness. I believe you said that when we undergo transference, when someone transfers upon us or we transfer, we get signed up, right? So transfer comes along with signing up or some form of belonging. But now what I'm linking here is the idea of transfer and transform and metamorphosis, and also the idea of interaction from Hélène and chemistry from Avital. Because it seems to me that it's one thing for Orlando to claim, I want another self, or to undergo a self-metamorphosis, a translation into another species or into one of the 6,000 other selves that are available. But it's another thing to say someone wants another self for me, or someone's desire for me is to be another self. And so finding oneself transformed into something else by virtue of a kind of primary transference on the part of whoever it is who is supposed to be caring for you. Right? And let's imagine that could be something other than a mother or a father, or I mean, it could be one of those things, but kinship actually extends, I think, beyond those terms. So the question is, in what ways do we morph or transform in relation to the compulsory and pressing desires of others? And can we think metamorphosis in relation to the transference at that formative level? And then I guess I just wanted to add this, that I think it's important that one of the people who binds us is Jacques Derrida. My colleagues here had very intense personal friendships with him that I would not be able to describe and could not describe. I certainly engaged his work and knew him on a much more formal level. But I think it's worth remembering that in the very early essay, Structure, Sign, and Play, it was Levi-Strauss's theory of kinship that he criticized. And it was precisely because, or one of the very important errors he thought Levi-Strauss made, was to think of kinship as structure and as static. And what he insisted was that structure is iterable, that it's subject to a temporal elaboration, and the only way a structure can form as a structure is through an iterability that is defined by its intervals and by what he called its ruptures. right? So that rupture became constitutive of structure. And it's interesting to me today that we're talking about kinship and disruption because it was Derrida who identified the rupture in structure as iterability then. So in some ways, if we think kinship now, we think kinship, I think in terms of those kinds of ruptures and reelaborations that were in some ways anticipated by that early work. I guess I would just add, it's extremely important to think kinship beyond the blood tie, but also to think about the metaphoricity of blood. Like, what is it we invest in blood? What is it we think blood is? Some anthropologists say blood is the most fictive moment. Might interest you. The most fictive moment in ethnography. Sarah Franklin has, I think, made that argument explicitly. And then finally, I suppose I would like to think a little bit more about the differences between adopting, grafting, incorporating, and cannibalizing. Right? Because some versions of that. What differences? Because it seems to me that that some of those are sustaining and loving, and then there's always that slightly murderous.
I'm so surprised to hear you make this distinction, but
Really?
go ahead. Honey.
Okay. Well, it's just that what I'm trying to kind of correct my exclusive focus on murder, because I do think.
Why?
Because I think.
So sweet.
Okay. Because I think that Hélène is inviting us to think about interactions that produce metamorphoses of another kind, that are not necessarily, that are not at least primarily or fatally murderous, right? I think that's one of the invitations you're making to us, and so I'm trying to respond.
Yeah.
It's your funeral.
No, I agree with everything you say. Let me just point to one word that I picked up on the way, because I'm a word picker. It's just both, because I'm jealous of that. Both or beide. We don't have it. We can't say both in French. And of course it has an impact on our thought.
You see, les
When
deux.
you have, on dit les deux.
Les deux.
We don't have both. And we need both. I mean, not that we need to be, etc. But, I miss both in French. Maybe to reject it. Maybe if I had it in French, I would reject it or, quarrel with it. But just to point to the fact that language is so essential. I mean, it determines so much of our affectivities, of our imaginary. It's huge. And we don't know that if we're not able to change language, to speak in other languages, in the original, and beware of translations that kill. Now, to come back to the blood topic, yes, the blood is, I pointed to one phantasm of blood, which we have. When we see our blood, we're anyway always, the first time we see our blood, it's always a shock. But then, of course, it carries histories, centuries of poison, of metaphors, it's always bad blood. And of racism, particularly, purity, etc., etc. So, but this, of course, is everywhere in tragedy. Regarding may I refer to Derrida, because I realized when Avital spoke that I'll confess something. I realized that I have entered a time when I very often, unconsciously, but I'm conscious of it, refrain from quoting him. I won't explain about that. It's huge, because since I've really quoted him, worked with him, spoken with him for 40 years, now I do realize that something is happening. So, it's not an anecdote, because it's very deep, actually. When you spoke about the fact that we are also summoned by the other to be the self they want us to be. I mean, when we are always, it always happens, supposed to respond to the projection or the desire of the other in a way, and we do answer either a little, obliquely, or not at all, etc., etc. So, indeed, we change, or we alter, or we metamorphose according to the willpower or the desire power of the other. Which is also the fact for Orlando, except that since Virginia Woolf is writing a kind of allegory, Orlando happens to be without a family, etc., which makes things simpler to narrate. Derrida has written a book which is called HC for Life, that is to say, en français, HC pour la vie, c'est-à-dire. And in this book, he relates something that belongs to the tie or the alliance between him and me, where he states that she has always been on the side of life, whereas I, for my part, have always been on the side of death, and I keep telling her, and I keep repeating to her, that in the end, death will come so early, life is going to be so short, etc., etc. But and we quarrel on and on. Now, this is a case, actually, because it's true. It's absolutely true what he says. The one thing that is not apparent, but is latent, is that for 40 years he would tell me, you don't understand that life is so short, etc., and you are on the side of life. And inside, I would say, as you would do inside loud, you know. I would say, but it's not true. I'm not on the side of life, etc., etc. But I couldn't do what Avital does, that is, speak inside out loud. So I would try and shake his deep-rooted belief. And I would try to suggest that maybe I'm not on the side of life, as he thinks, or as he had decided from the very first day. And I think it took me 40 years before I started, before once I said firmly, but what if I were not on the side of life, as you think? But he brushed it away immediately because it was impossible. It was not, I mean, it couldn't get, he couldn't, I mean, it would have destroyed completely the construction of his life and death predicament. And you know what happened? It happened that I became, I mean, I couldn't help being on the side of life because it was stronger than me. What was stronger than me was his relation to death.
Shall we call it an evening? I think we should, and thank everybody on this panel. And